Today's topic, we decided, is the idea of story, the
Mm,
storyteller, and the stories we tell ourselves. Usually, stories we create and make up in our head as explanation of why things happened or are happening, as a way to make meaning, to give context. Among other things. And sometimes the stories are great and sometimes they're not so great. In fact, usually most of the time they're not so great. They're pretty negative. Why did you want to talk about stories today? Tell me what
yeah.
inspired.
Well, I was taking my little dog walk in the morning. It's just this beautiful morning, right? The air is crisp, it's fall, and the sun is shining. And I'm just walking down the road, and all of a sudden, I catch myself kind of like getting this little blip of like anxiety or like this blip of like this hit in my body, like something's not right. I'm like, oh, I know that's a cue to look inward. What am I thinking? What's going on? I was like, oh, I'm telling myself a story. And I haven't talked to a friend in like a couple days. And the story maker in my mind decides to like create this story. Well, maybe she's mad at me, or maybe she doesn't want to be my friend anymore. Or like rather than just thinking she's busy like I haven't reached out either. And I knew in that moment how ridiculous it was. And I was like, oh, this is a story. And I like to think of stories as this like crazy incessant wheel, this wheel of suffering. And you have to take a stick and jam it in the spoke of the wheel and just like stop the story. It's hard because there's so many of them. But I did that. And then I brought myself into the present moment. And I looked down and there was just this beautiful, like, I guess it would be considered a weed, but it's purple flower. It's a purple flower. And I just like took in the texture of it and the color and the shape of the petals. And I was just like, oh, it feels so good. And then I kept walking, doing my thing. And boom, there's another story. And I was like, holy mackerel, all of these stories, like, they don't stop. I think they consume us. We make up stories about everything because we're so uncomfortable not knowing. So we make up these stories and they're lies. They're based usually on our shadows, they're based on our wounds, they're based on our beliefs. Our beliefs are just things we decided to think over and over again until we thought were true. And the only way to shift out of these incessant stories is to recognize them and then drop into the present moment. And then I thought, this is the last piece I want to share is, oh my gosh, I'm the author of the novel of my life. I have all these pages, they're blank. The pen is in my hand. And what if the stories I tell could actually like open me up to expansion? What if they can improve my self-worth? What if they can improve my confidence? What if they can enhance and deepen the connection in my relationships and intimacy? Like, what if the stories I tell could make me feel amazing about myself and my body and life and people and everything? And it was just this magical moment. So I just wanted to share that. And I noticed the benefit of really dropping into the present, gazing up at the mountains after the story and being like, look at these mountains and the way the sun was glistening, or just anything that you can find in your home.
Which is
But
a
yeah, that was
really,
my story.
yeah, and doing that grounding work you did, that sensory, um, checking in with the present is a great way to stick, that poker
Stick.
and the spokes to stop the stories. That's what a really effective way to do it, to just bring yourself to the present.
Mhm.
Great. Yeah. So let's talk about this idea of stories and creating stories, which when I first started my spiritual journey, my journey of self-awareness, of opening, whatever it is that we want to call it. Some people find this type of work and language on, a journey of sobriety or healing, recovery from a trauma or a life interruption. And we want to make sense of what's going on in our lives. And so we look for the story. And to respond to a few things you said, number one, story isn't always negative. Like there are great, we tell great stories too, how our love for, our partner, our spouse, or the
Mm.
home that we live in, the synchronicities we see in the world, the coincidences, right? All of these can be really wonderful stories, but more often than not, we tell ourselves stories. Uh, and I remember the first time, and this would have been 10 years ago when I started working with Christine Kane, who is a soul led business coach for creative entrepreneurs. At least that's what she was when I met her, and came into contact with her. And I was in a session with her. There were, 100, other women there. And she started talking about this idea of dropping the story, drop your story. I honestly, and for a long time, had no idea what she meant. So
Mm.
someone would, stand up and they'd start talking about their business and why they're doing what they're doing and why it hasn't been successful and what walls they're running into, what challenges keep coming up. And she would look at them and say, drop the story. And I remember getting so frustrated, like, I don't even know what this means to drop the story. And I think one way to know that you're telling yourself a story is anytime you have to use the word because.
Mm.
This is one way. I don't think it's the only way, and it's also maybe not foolproof. I'm living with this for a little bit, but as I was thinking about it, I think about your this friend that you hadn't touched base with for a few days because she doesn't like me, because I've done something, because I'm a terrible friend. Or so I think anytime, because the fact that you guys have been out of touch is neutral.
Totally.
That's just a fact. It is what it is. It's
Yeah.
like, this is a pin. That's neutral. Because, and then that's when we get into the story, right? We take something that's neutral. I met Jim tonight. And then we start adding all of this because it was meant to be and we're fated to be together. And because this happened, and then right, we start getting into the story of this situation. So if you had to explain to someone, what does it mean to drop the story? How would you explain it? How would you coach someone through identifying when they are making a story?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Kate, I just want to say, I love that you always just add in a little like glimmer of truth. And you made sure that we all knew that we do tell really beautiful stories and we do tell really great stories. And I love that. So thank you. Um, for me personally, and I'm curious what the listeners would think or how they would identify when they're in story. But for me, there's a kind of a yucky, like ick kind of feeling, one that feels like abrupt, kind of like a hit in my like chest or my gut. And it doesn't, it feels a little like I start to get a little anxious when I tell myself stories about things. And it's not like out of control. It's just like a little flutter of anxiety. And so that's the identification part when you're, for me, when you're in the story. And then I ask myself, well, what am I thinking that's creating this feeling in my body? And I'm like, oh, I'm telling myself a story. That's not true. I'm making something up and it's not in alignment with my soul. It's my ego. It's my ego talking. And and then I ask, okay, what's next? Like how can I shift out of this? And for me, the great shift out is dropping into the present for a moment and gratitude, even like when I was looking at those purple flowers, I was like, oh, hello, precious little purple flowers. And then the second story, I looked at the mountains. And the third story, I caught the glistening sun and the dew and the grass, like this beautiful golden shimmer. And then I was able to ask myself, all right, what do I actually want to think? What do I want to believe? What kind of story do I want to tell myself? And it's usually just like hand on the heart and compassion and shifting the pattern. How does all that land with you? Or do you relate to any of that? I mean, this whole being present thing is kind of new to me. It came to me on that walk the other day. But how about you?
Um, yeah, I've been taking notes. And so to capture some of this stuff, and I so appreciate your willingness to be so vulnerable and to share. I don't think you realize how in sharing your process, how much education there is that we can kind of extrapolate. Um,
That's good.
this idea of, when you talk about when I feel something, so when I feel anxious, I then check in with my thinking and see what I'm thinking, right? And that's like meta thinking, the thinking about our thinking. And that's what awareness is, and consciousness is not just the thinking, but the awareness of the content and context of your thoughts. Well, what is the overarching? And I was listening to something this morning, and a podcast this morning, and was reminded of the fact that a feeling generally only lasts, according to science, so science, hashtag science, 15 seconds.
Oh, I heard 90.
Okay, so let's say
Okay.
15 to 90 seconds. Yeah. So a sensation in your body will last 15 to 90 seconds. This can be anxiety, this can be fear, this can be excitement, this can be joy. The way that we keep it going is once we feel the excitement or once we feel the sensation, we then begin to, oh, I am feeling this way because.
Yeah, we intellectualize it.
We intellectualize it, we give it an explanation, we give it content. We can't just have the feeling and be like, oh, that's interesting that I'm having that.
So true.
Right, and go on with our business. That's not what we do. Our brains want to understand everything, right? Not our consciousness, not our minds, but our brains want to understand everything and give explanation and meaning, because we do hate uncertainty. I can't just have a feeling for no reason. There's got to be a reason I'm experiencing this. And so we begin to construct a story. And those stories then propagate the felt experience, the felt
Yeah.
experience, right? I'm feeling anxious because, oh, I've got a presentation coming up tomorrow and I'm not sure I'm prepared for it. And then that makes me feel more anxious. And then I get more, and then I tell more, oh, they're going to hate me. It's going to be so boring. I'm going to fail. It's going to be miserable. I get right?
Yeah. Yeah. And before you
Instead
know
of,
it, you're
yeah, instead of,
feeling really bad.
yeah, stopping ourselves,
Mhm.
taking that breath, and finding a more productive and expansive, generous, self-compassionate story,
Yeah.
context, meaning to give to whatever it is, or looking for the multiple. I'm feeling, really grumpy this morning. Well, it could be because, I stayed up too late watching Netflix, and what a bum I am, and God, can't you even get to bed on time, right? It, or it could be because it's that, I'm someplace in my cycle and this is what my hormone, and this, some mornings I wake up grumpy. Or it could be, you know there are, to look for other stories also, and other, and then we can choose, we can sit down on, so to speak, we can choose the story that causes the least amount of suffering.
Yes. Yeah. I'm fascinated with this concept of being the author of our own novel, with the pen in our hand, and what stories do we really want to tell ourselves? What if our stories can be absolutely in service to our soul, to our higher self, to all the things that we really do desire and want to live in alignment and integrity with, to bring up our last chat. I think I'm just finding that concept really fascinating. I think as a culture, we are all really addicted to perhaps suffering and to our problems. And it's like, do people know what to even talk about besides their problems,
Besides the
right?
trauma.
Yeah. But what about like talking about possibilities, and that's when I get that vision of like, well, the pen's in my hand kind of thing. And
Mhm.
and what is the story that I do want to write? And also looking at what we are telling ourselves and having compassion, because like I said, I think a lot of the negative or limiting stories that we tell ourselves, they do stem from our pain, and they do stem from our trauma, and they do stem from our wounds. And just caring and being gentle with ourselves, like, oh, I'm thinking this thought because wow, I really love this friend, I really love her. Maybe I should shift that to gratitude. I love this friend so much, it feels
What
so
if
good.
I shifted this to gratitude,
Right.
right?
Yeah, what if I shifted it to gratitude? Same with my kiddos, being a mom of two girls. Like, I love my kids, and sometimes fear comes up, like, gosh, I love them. They're going for a long drive in a car. Like, the fear comes up as a mom, and it's like, oh, hello, fear. Like, rather than getting into a story about it, oh, the roads are going to be wet, or, just I care so much about my children. I love my children so much. I'm so grateful to have them in my life. I like to think of Brene Brown's catastrophizing too. And she said one of the ways to shift out of catastrophizing, which is the story,
Mhm.
is gratitude. It's like the one destroyer of catastrophizing and making up scary stories in your head.
I've got a prickly relationship with gratitude.
You do. I love that. Tell me more about
And
your
we
prickly
should,
relationship with
yeah,
gratitude.
we
I don't
should,
want to bypass anything either. I want to make that clear.
yeah, well, I think it would make a good episode at some point. the the relationship with gratitude, because it can get bypassy, and I think the experience of gratitude is something very personal, and what one is grateful for, and how one expresses or embodies that gratitude. So we'll put a pin on that, and we'll talk about that later. That's a great subject for another. I would say, staying with this topic of the story, some of what you're talking about is that catastrophizing, right? It's like anticipatory, it's building out the, worst possible scenario of what could happen. And we suffer in that because, in all likelihood, who was it? Mark Twain, most of the things I worried about never happened, right? Some to paraphrase that quote. And I think it's also really important to be very aware of the stories we tell ourselves about the past, our past. Um, and this is coming up in a collective way when we think about the way American history or US history is taught, and how that intersects and integrates with who is telling the story.
Oof. Don't get me started on this one, Kate.
Right. Yeah. And this is an example, if we talk about Jung and shadow work, I mean, he gets into archetypes and metaphor and myth. And that is an example of sort of a collective archetype of story is, what we read in the history books,
Yeah.
and how we explain how we got to where we are. And sometimes people have a history story that is full of rainbows and gold and wonderful things, and they've never had a bad day, and isn't life just wonderful? And then other folks have a story of just every day is a struggle, and nobody has seen trouble like I've seen trouble, right? I'm more on this end, right? No one understands my suffering. Right, is the story I tell myself, and I propagate that story. And I really had to do a lot of work in the past couple of years, because this work doesn't come, it it takes a lot of awareness and practice to really, uh, you're making 1 degree shifts in mind, right? If you want to turn a ship around, you don't do it all at once. You turn by like 1 degree, 1 degree, 1 degree. Right, you're not just gonna like whip it around and all of a sudden you're on a new course. Like, no, it's gonna.
Mm,
So I think about that, and I think about this concept in terms of the stories we tell ourselves about past action, past experiences, what we shame ourselves around, and the stories we tell ourselves around around episodes that we feel ashamed about. And that sometimes we can go back and look at them through a different lens and find other stories we could tell ourselves.
Yeah. I like that. I think that's part of the healing process and kind of redirecting the stories that are not really serving us to ones that are, without bypassing, of course. I was wondering, as you were talking, what would you say the difference between a story is and a belief? Or do stories shape our beliefs?
Yeah, I think stories shape our beliefs and beliefs shape our stories.
Okay.
The difference between a story,
This is a tough one. I was like, either the
yeah,
same.
and a belief. Well, certainly when I think about just the quality of the two, belief to me feels much more foundational. It feels, um,
Mm, that word, yes. Yeah.
you know, and from that, our stories can take root, right? Maybe it's that stories are the branches of the belief.
Mm, yeah. Yeah. Like our core beliefs and or core wounds that kind of shape the stories too. When you said foundation, though, that actually really resonated with me because I guess stories are, they can be make believe. They like we can recognize that they're not completely true, but the beliefs I think we really do believe are true.
Yes. Although I tell you, and I'm sure you've run into this as a coach, you try and take someone's story away from them and they will resist.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I
You,
never even thought about that. You're right, though, because they identify with it. Who are they without their story? Who are we without our story? Oh my gosh. Do you know what just came up for me is think about when you get together with a new friend for like the first time, right?
just had this experience. So
You did?
yeah,
Well, funny. Here's what I want to say, but usually we kind of like pour out our story to a certain degree. And I just am like thinking about where I was, even 10 years ago compared to now. Like, I don't want to pour out the old story anymore. I'm kind of like, ugh, gross. Like, that doesn't serve me. Like, that's old. Like, I don't want to go into the whole story about, my relationship with this person and that person, my mother. Like, no, it's like, where am I right now today? And who am I today? And I love this. So please tell me what you're.
I think when you get tired of telling a story, that is such an important moment. So I had an
Yes.
experience. I had an experience a couple of weeks ago. I got together. So I've got a fella here in Atlanta, and we had dinner with another couple. He had met the husband through a hiking group and had become friends with him. This was the first time I was meeting the husband and the wife. And they didn't know me. They didn't know me. They didn't know my story. They didn't know all of these things about, they don't know that my dad's a Baptist preacher. They don't know that my brother spent time in prison. They don't know I went to Italy to study mask. They don't know I went through this devastating divorce. They don't know. They don't know. They don't know. And I sat there thinking, and I made a joke to Matt as we left about, I'm not going to trauma bond, in which we pour out all of the story, right? So that I was like, I'm really going to work on not trauma bonding tonight. I was like, I don't know what I'm going to talk about. I don't know what there's to talk about, but I'm not going to tell any of these stories, right?
Yeah.
So we had a lovely time. There was conversation. It was all very much grounded in the present. I didn't whisper one word about any of this stuff that I had been carrying.
Nice
And it
job.
was so freeing. And I thought, these people don't know any of my sad story. Right.
Love
And
it.
I thought I can be, and so then I can be I can identify, I can be anyone I want in this moment. And so then the next thing I thought, as I was sitting there, they had a pool. They had this really lovely, like infinity style pool and a big, I mean, it was gorgeous. And um, the boys were in the water and she was upstairs finishing up something. And I was sitting on the lip and just thinking like, okay, well, if this question, who am I without my story? What remains?
It's those blank pages in your novel, Kate. Like,
Yeah, like what qualities of, and also it can feel a little groundless.
interesting.
Like without all of this story, if I can be anyone in this moment, these people don't know anything about me. I could tell them anything I wanted. And I think also, that I was like, God, okay, so then what keeps me attached to me?
Oh, there's some shadow in that, right?
Yeah, like what is it that is the through line of Kate through all of this, regardless of the circumstances?
Something intuitively just came to me, the word accountability, that without your story, then it's like you're held accountable to rise above that story. You've removed like that upper limit, like you've broken through to the next without that story. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. And I will tell you that in that moment, it was so freeing. It felt like I had just laid down a 500-pound brick.
Oh, yes.
You
I
know,
love
just, I don't have to be Sisyphus pushing that up the hill. I can let it go.
So earlier in the podcast, you said that you didn't really know what drop the story meant. And I think you figured it out.
I finally had such a strong visceral experience of
Oh, the
dropping the
boulder.
story.
You're like, see ya. That's beautiful, Kate. I love that. And then it's like, well, who are you becoming? What are you
Can I
becoming?
just not become anything? Can I just,
You actually can. Yeah, you
yeah, for a
actually
moment,
can.
I just want to enjoy this, like, without, because this is something else we always do to ourselves is then immediately, okay, well, what's the next thing, right?
Right, right. But it's who are you
But
with,
but I also take your point. I know that
just who are you without your story? That's all, and maybe that is the being without, just being right now. Not that you need to become, the next best this or become that, but it's what's growing in you, what's evolving in you in the stillness. Like right now, you're the bulb that is under the ground and it's fall, it's perfect time. You're going dormant maybe in a really beautiful way.
I have this vision. It's more like George of the Jungle.
Oh my gosh, I love your visions.
or
Tell me about.
curious or Curious George, where like I'm flying through the jungle and the vines are our stories, right?
Mhm.
And in order to like go on to another vine, I have to let go of the previous one.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. And sometimes we really love a vine and we want to hold on to the vine. Like, oh, I love living in this story. And sometimes it's a beautiful story. It's a story of love and contentment and satisfaction and just you're joyful about everything in your life and you just want to hang on to that story, right? Um, and then other times we're hanging on to withered vines that are dry and prickly but we know that vine. We're familiar
Yeah.
with that vine.
Yeah, word, that's another piece of the resistance to letting go of story is the comfort and the familiarity that we know. We know that story. We
Yeah,
know that.
we know it, and our brains don't like uncertainty. That's how the story got created anyway.
Ah,
And
yeah.
unless we, because it is a, ooh, it's a feeling that's got some zazz and zingle to it. This like, ooh, this version of like, oh, okay, I don't have a story. Like, Everyone wants to know what your story is, what you do for work, and where you come from, and who your people are, and what your experiences have been.
Totally.
Um, and we build ourselves in our stories.
We do. And they shape us and make us. When you were talking about the vines and George of the Jungle, or Curious George, it reminded me of that reading, The Trapeze. Do you know that reading?
No, I'm not familiar with it.
Um, it's it's about the void, as a trapeze artist is holding on to, the past and reaching into the future. There's a moment where they're suspended in air, and they're not grabbing onto anything. And they talk, so I think you're in that void right now. And perhaps it's unnerving. That's why there was like that, oh my gosh, can I just be like, can I not go to like, what am I becoming? You're literally
Yeah.
suspended in air right now. And that can either feel really exhilarating or really scary, and both simultaneously, I bet. And I just want to really honor where you're at right now and the beauty of that, because I feel that, a void is something that ultimately or eventually will be filled with
It will be
something,
felt.
but there's magic in that void. There's magic in that void.
And we can be intentional about filling it, or we can let sort of nature, nature abhors a vacuum. It's going to fill it in. So we can either do it with intentionality, sort of architecting, being the author,
Yeah.
and I don't want to gloss over this idea of dropping the story, letting go, and forgiveness. Because we also hold stories against people.
We really do.
We hold
Yeah.
stories against people, right? This is called holding a grudge, right? It's holding the story. Imagine if you were to drop the story around a particular grudge that someone may have. Um, certainly one of the things lessons that I did not fully integrate until after leaving my marriage was what it meant to really drop the story and forgive someone for something. Um, but we're not good at that. We hold stories against people, and we're resistant to letting them go. And I think about this in terms of ego, because ego so often defines itself by saying what it's not. Well, I'm not that. Well,
Mm.
at least I don't do that. At least I don't shop there. I shop here, right? Like that's how we tell the story of. That's part of how we tell the story of ourselves. Um, and to really let go of things like the vine, we have to drop the story. And again, it's another aspect that people, I know I get resistant around. Well, if I let go of that, then I've got no reason to be angry. And then I
Yeah,
just
that's
be
yeah.
happy.
Yeah. What happens when you're not angry, right? Then you might have to look inward too. Then you might have to look at like where the anger is coming from within yourself. I was thinking about that as you said that. And I was also thinking that one more piece to this story thing is how we think we really know someone, and how story is also wrapped up in the assumptions. We assume that this person, I mean, it comes up all the time in my marriage. Like I'm making an assumption, but one time a therapist once told me to look at my two children as if I had no idea who they were and get to know them. So I had to drop the stories, right? Oh,
Yeah.
Kira's yes, Kylie's like that. And, you know, same with my husband and the people in our lives, our family. Like we think we know them, but we are not in them. We
Yeah.
only know parts of their ego, parts that of themselves that allow themselves to be seen, but we form stories around that. So I just love how what you said kind of like spawned this other piece. And I love how many like little sidetracks we could always take with these things.
So we've covered a lot of ground today.
We did. Yeah. How can we wrap up this piece on story? What would you like to say?
Um, Well, I think for those who might be just listening or coming across this concept for the first time, this idea of dropping the story,
Mm,
start first with beginning to see if you can identify your stories. Be careful, be aware of the assumptions you're making. That is a big one. This friend isn't calling me because there's that because word, right? She's selfish, or, she doesn't care about me, or, I've upset this person in some way, right? Whatever assumptions we make. And I love this idea of looking at people with fresh eyes, like being like,
are you?
who
Yeah.
are you? Yeah. Like we're all just sort of like these alien creatures that have landed here, and we're like, who are you?
Yes.
um sorry. So I think if you're new to this concept, being aware of anytime you're making assumption, using the word because, and what you tell people about yourself,
Mm,
because that is certainly, part of your story is what you tell people about yourself. And um yeah, that's what I would say. What would you like people to take away, or put a fine point on?
well, I love that, Kate, what you shared. Um, you know, again, I'm just going to go back to the when you're not feeling great in your body, when you're hit with a little gut punch or a throat tightness, or you're feeling a little anxious, or you're not present. You're walking down the road and you don't even know you're walking down a road. Stop and ask yourself, what are you thinking? And get curious and compassionately curious about what you are thinking and the story you're telling yourself, and be willing to take the stick and stick it in the spoke of that wheel of suffering, that wheel of samskara, and ask yourself, where do you really want to direct where, first of all, offer that compassion and acceptance, and then where do you really want to direct your stories? And again, the question of, like, what can be possible? What if my
Mm,
stories can really bring me to life? What if my stories can help me love people even more deeply? Like, I love that question. I just love the possibility question. Like, what if these stories can enhance this or that? And I just love that.
that's great. I think that's a wonderful gift to leave people with, is wonderful in questions and inquiries like that. What's possible? That's really fantastic. That's great. All right, let's take a deep breath in together and exhale. Yes, thank you for your time today.
Yeah, for your
And we will see you guys next time.